Aaron Patterson's case has gripped Australia and sparked intense public interest due to the chilling combination of domestic conflict, an ordinary dish turned deadly, and the presence of a highly toxic natural ingredient, death cap mushrooms. The story unfolded in the quiet town of Leongatha, Victoria, and reads almost like a modern-day mystery novel, except that its tragic consequences are all too real. Patterson, a woman in her 40s, was recently convicted of murdering 3 of her relatives by serving them a homemade beef Wellington laced with death cap mushrooms, one of the world's most lethal fungi. The victims, Gail and Don Patterson, her former in-laws, and Heather Wilkinson, her former sister-in-law, died shortly after the lunch, while Ian Wilkinson, Heather's husband, barely survived after spending weeks in intensive care. The case hinges on a single Sunday lunch in July 2023. Aaron Patterson had invited her estranged husband's family to her home. While some reports initially suggested the lunch was meant to be a reconciliation gesture, the fallout has since pointed in a darker direction. Patterson prepared beef Wellington, a dish traditionally made with beef fillet, mushroom duxelle, and puff pastry. But unlike any ordinary recipe, this version contained a deadly twist. The guests consumed the meal, fell ill hours later, and were hospitalized with severe gastrointestinal symptoms. Over the next few days, 3 of them succumbed to liver failure, an expected outcome of death cap mushroom poisoning if not treated rapidly and effectively, often through liver transplant. Aaron, curiously, remained entirely unharmed. This discrepancy in health outcomes immediately raised suspicion. Patterson initially claimed she had bought the mushrooms from an Asian grocery store and that she herself had eaten the meal without suffering any ill effects. She later revised her statement, saying she had used a mix of button mushrooms and dried mushrooms, and had removed part of the meal to feed her children, who were also unaffected. Investigators found these claims inconsistent and troubling. Experts quickly identified symptoms typical of Amanita phalloides poisoning, including severe vomiting, diarrhea, and delayed liver damage. Toxicology tests confirmed the presence of death cap toxins in the victim's systems. What makes death cap mushrooms particularly insidious is that they look quite similar to edible mushrooms and taste relatively mild, which can make them easy to mistake in foraging or obscure them in a cooked dish. However, they contain amatoxins that resist heat and are deadly even in small amounts. The toxins initially cause gastrointestinal distress, followed by a deceptive period of improvement, before triggering catastrophic liver and kidney failure. It's difficult to believe anyone could accidentally include them in a meal without recognizing the potential danger, especially given that cases of mushroom poisoning, while rare, are heavily publicized in Australia due to the deadly nature of the fungus. Patterson's evolving narrative and lack of remorse proved pivotal in the trial. Prosecutors highlighted her history of disputes with her former in-laws and marriage breakdown. They presented a pattern of behavior that pointed toward premeditation rather than negligence. One of the more damning pieces of evidence was a food dehydrator that police found discarded at a local tip, which Patterson admitted to throwing away in a panic after the poisonings. Investigators suspected that the dehydrator had been used to prepare or dry the mushrooms used in the meal, thereby strengthening the argument that she had knowingly introduced a toxic ingredient into her cooking. The defense maintained that Patterson was not a mushroom expert and had no motive to harm her family. They argued that she had simply made a terrible mistake, possibly by including mushrooms she did not realize were dangerous. However, this line of defense failed to persuade the jury, particularly in light of her behavior following the lunch. Her failure to disclose the food dehydrator's disposal, the absence of illness in her and her children, and her reluctance to cooperate fully with investigators painted a picture of someone who was trying to cover her tracks rather than a remorseful cook overwhelmed by a tragic accident. The conviction has reverberated across Australia, raising broader concerns about food safety, foraging practices, and the dynamics of family conflict. Though deaths from mushroom poisoning are rare in the country, this case serves as a cautionary tale about the risks of wild mushrooms, particularly when combined with underlying tensions and unresolved family grievances. In the aftermath, calls have been renewed for better public education on mushroom identification, stricter regulations on mushroom sales and markets, and more awareness around domestic violence and its less obvious manifestations. For the families of the victims, the conviction provides a form of closure, though nothing can truly make up for the loss of loved ones in such a harrowing and preventable way. Friends and relatives described Don and Gail Patterson as loving parents and grandparents, and Heather Wilkinson as a kind and generous person. Their deaths have left a hole in their community, especially in the church circles where Heather and her husband were active members. Ian Wilkinson's recovery, though miraculous, is said to be ongoing, both physically and emotionally. He lost his wife, his health, and a large part of his world in one afternoon. Aaron Patterson's sentencing will take place in the coming months, and the court is expected to consider the premeditated nature of the crime, the number of victims, and her apparent lack of accountability when determining the punishment. Legal experts suggest she may face a lengthy prison sentence, potentially life imprisonment, given the gravity and deliberateness of the act. In the meantime, the case continues to be analyzed by criminologists and psychologists as an example of how complex motives and relationships can lead to incomprehensible actions. There's also been public discussion about how gender plays into the case. Female perpetrators of violent crime, especially involving poison, tend to attract more media sensationalism due to the rarity and unexpectedness of the act. The killer-cook narrative has been echoed in newspapers, on social media, and across talk shows. But beyond the headlines lies a profoundly unsettling reality. People trusted someone they knew, shared a meal around her table, and died as a result. The Aaron Patterson case won't soon be forgotten in Australia. It's a story of trust broken, of lethal knowledge either ignored or wielded with intent, and of a meal that was supposed to bring people together instead serving as the catalyst for irreparable loss. Whether Patterson ever fully confesses or not, the evidence has been enough to convince a jury, and a nation, that this was not a tragic mistake, but a deliberate act of murder with mushrooms as the instrument. The memory of Dawn, Gail, and Heather now lives on as part of a cautionary tale with lessons about food, family, and the sometimes invisible fissures that can exist behind closed doors.